Hello team, everything is all going well this side in Crawley in little old England, and I know that everything is working well for our producer, the fantastic Radia Nunez over there in Denver, Colorado. A special guest today is somebody that has come to a couple of my talks over the years, and he's a guy that's always interested me because as many of you may know, I'm of Irish ethnicity, although I was brought up in the UK, but I'm from an Irish family. And I know that coming from Liverpool, which is considered to be the capital of Ireland over here, is that we've all kissed the Blarney Stone. And our guest today is a particular example of this. This guy really is incredible. His life history is phenomenal, which I'll get him to talk about a little bit. But for instance, you know, he's gained 2 gold medals in martial arts. He is a dentist. He has a degree in, I think it's genetics or something similar, but he'll explain that. I think I'm also right in saying he was in an Irish boy band many years ago. The story just goes on and on. But he's a highly erudite speaker, and he really knows his stuff. He very much takes approach from the scientific point of view. And indeed, there was an event I did in London around about 18 months ago, which was a formal debate at the Swedenborg Society in Holborn, and Rory stood up from the audience and was absolutely amazing, and it was really effectively, I was sensed that we should have actually invited him up onto the stage because of his powerful stance in terms of to use the term anti-materialist reductionism isn't the right term, but actually arguing that there's a deeper level of reality, because Rory is one of these special guys that actually teaches and works with lucid dreaming. Another version, I suppose, of the out-of-body experience. Now, Rory and I recently I did an interview for his show, which I'll put a link up on Facebook in the next hour or two after we've finished, which is well worth listening to. But I was interviewed by Rory, and it was absolutely fascinating discussion, and I've just been so keen to pick up on a lot of the issues that we spoke about last time. But I know that Rory will be introducing in this talk 1 or 2 of his new theories. Now, I strongly advise beg, steal or borrow a copy of this book, which I think was probably looking like it's in mirror image, but it is Rory's latest book, and it is one of the best books I've read on lucid dreaming ever. Believe me, this is exceptional stuff, and beg, steal or borrow a copy. So without further ado, welcome aboard, Rory.
Listen, thank you both. Thank you for having me on board. We've got some great stuff to get through. Largely because of just how much we have in common, which, as you said, we have alluded to in our previous talk and our personal interactions by all means. But I want to kind of get under the hood of some of that stuff today, specifically about the cheating the ferryman hypothesis, about the daemon, and perhaps about the quantum, the infinite mind field, so to speak, and your kind of understanding of quantum mechanics and how we can relate these matters. So can I take the reins of this conversation briefly? First of all, incidentally, apologize for my background and my spooky type apparatus here. Anybody looking in video, I must look like I'm a fucking proverbial ghost, but that's just how it is. I took the back room, and the back room is, well, it's lit differently.
Rory, you actually look like, if anybody's interested in the history of cinema, a guy called Meunier did a very famous movie called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and you look like your back set is a bit of German expressionism from the 1930s. Right. It is very, very good. Okay, but fire away, Rory. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, okay. Well, so, I mean, you know, at the risk of boring people about my own kind of, this is who I am, this is what I do. My background is, I suppose, martial arts has been a huge influence for me. I've been in martial arts since I was 10 years old. As Anthony said, I competed internationally, and I've placed internationally at European and world level. And very much that's been the backbone of my thinking, is in, you know, the kind of, I think what attracted me to martial arts initially, to be totally frank, was the mystical element to it, but that's not what I discovered when I got into it. It was very more prosaic. It was a different time. Martial arts had become at that point a kind of a sport, a form of self-defense, and it had lost its roots in its more metaphysical expression so to speak. Having kind of exhausted that avenue from the point of view of finding anything of the mysterious nature, I turned towards science. Naturally, I did a degree in dentistry, and as Anthony said, I've also got a degree in genetics. The dentistry gives me a background in biology, gives me a good background in science in general. I'm not going to pretend that pulling or placing teeth gives me any insight into the metaphysical nature of reality. Suffice to say, there's a bit of yin-yang there. But taking that aside, it does give me, as I said, a kind of rational approach to understanding the nature of matters. I am scientifically trained, and I do understand how we appraise matters from a scientific perspective. If I'm going to perform a surgical procedure, it's not because it takes my fancy, it's because it has been considered by a peer of my colleagues to be the best approach based on the evidence that they have acquired through performing various procedures and monitoring and measuring them. So that's a very important aspect of how we, talk about these matters. We must, as much as we can do, take this scientific approach. Otherwise, we might be just kind of chasing our own tails in the darkness, so to speak, and that's not necessarily going to get us anywhere. My more kind of metaphysical concern emerged perhaps a little later in life, and once more I kind of took up that journey to rediscover magic and actually got into sleight of hand artistry, specifically, magic as in performance magic. I thought I was going to find something in there that I didn't find, as it happens, which was I genuinely felt that there was some possibility of finding something of the proverbial magic nature in there. I don't mean trickery, I mean real magic, as some of it is so convincing I thought it would be there. But I didn't find what I was looking for there, but when I was in there, I tripped over a stone in there, which was this idea of lucid dreaming. It just happened to pop up in a little piece of literature I was reading about dreams at the time when I was designing a magic trick. And it immediately took my fancy, this idea that you could become conscious in the dream state. And to me, the implications of that were immediate and profound. The fact that we could become conscious in our dream state would give, for my 10 cents at least, that would give me an opportunity to experience real magic. And that's kind of where I began the journey in its, in its real sense. It was when I started to specifically look at that idea of lucid dreaming. And when I did, it was like taking a duck to water, so to speak. It was something that just literally clicked with me at every possible level, psychologically, physiologically, socially. Everything about my mind that I desired was going to be in this experience if I could somehow unlock it. This was the thing I was looking for, and I did unlock it and became very efficient and started to experience and experiment a lot with it, and that's where I've taken the journey to until today. So I think I had bored people enough with that idea. I want to get to theories specifically. Let me get into my own kind of theory, if that's all right, because I want to show you, Anthony, more so how it picks up with your theory. And I dare say I who influenced who and how much of your work is in my work, I don't know. These things are impossible questions to answer, but you'll find so much in common, and certainly you'll probably have to some extent have to question, how much of it I've ripped off you. But here's the idea. So the theory I'm working with at the moment is what I call the bicentric mind theory. And this is my own idea that the universe, we could say, could exist in a certain way. That's material reductionism 101. The universe exists in a certain way. And the way it exists can be defined by a particular equation, a particular formula. Our best attempt at the moment would be E equals mc squared, followed perhaps by F equals ma, maybe by the Schrodinger wave function and so forth. So you can kind of take your pick of these various equations. And what they're mathematical descriptions of the universe that show the universe acts in a certain way. And when we use these mathematical essays, we can make predictions, and with those predictions, we can test them to prove that, in fact, what we predict is, in fact, the outcome, and hence is the testament to the success of the equation, and it stands, therefore, as a kind of law of physics. Now, a law is a very interesting word, because there are laws to physics, of course, but let's not confuse a law with a fact. I mean, law in its context, and Anthony, you certainly have more of an idea of this than I would, but law basically is something that can be changed. Just because we do things a certain way today, for example, alcohol was once illegal in this country, as was homosexuality. And today we've got, gay marriage, and we've got, alcohol to celebrate the gay marriage when we have it. So the law about marriage for homosexuality and alcohol has been changed. So no fact has been changed. These things have always existed, but what has changed is the way we interact with them. So a law of physics does not mean a fact. A law of physics means it's the way we interact with it currently, and that may be changed depending on how we perceive it. Now, even Einstein will tell you that the special theory of relativity is not a fact, but it's simply a way of measuring the universe. But of course, reductionist, materialist type people will confuse that for a fact and say, no, that's just what it is. It's a law of physics, and the laws are fixed, and that's the end of that. But that's a misinterpretation. So that's the first thing to establish. So if we say that what Einstein does is he gives us a perfect mathematical description of the universe, which proves to be both, it can be proven through, various experimental apparati. Moreover, it makes predictions, like, for example, the crooked orbit around Mercury that couldn't be accommodated by Newton's physics was eventually shown to be proven by Einstein's physics. So it improves our previous theory of gravity, and Einstein shows us that, in fact, it's actually something completely different eventually with his general theory of relativity. So what exactly Einstein is doing is he's showing us that the universe can be described by a particular mathematical essay, which we know works. So if we take this axiom that the universe can be described by mathematical essays, one would extrapolate that ultimately we may be able to produce a mathematical essay that describes the universe in its essence, and that mathematical essay that describes the universe in its essence would be the proverbial theory of everything, the TOE, so to speak. Now, that's where science is heading currently. We're trying to define more and more elaborate mathematical expressions, ultimately to try to yield something that will marry quantum physics with Einstein's physics. And that would be some sort of a master theory, so to speak. Now, if we did eventually get that theory, here's the question. If we got that theory, is it possible that although it's correct, that the theory is correct in as much as it can be correct, but if that theory is correct, is it exclusive? In other words, if we have a perfect theory of everything, is it possible that we can also have another theory of everything which is also correct? In other words, it's not necessarily that it contradicts it, but that the universe can be described in a certain way, but it can also be described in another way, which is also correct. So now we have this idea of two descriptions both ultimately saying the same thing, although they're saying it in very different ways. And this is kind of where I start looking at the model of how we can look at the thing. So everybody's looking for a single theory of everything. That's the kind of axiom we've decided is the only thing that's going to work. But if we had, let's say, a perfect mathematical system, the only perfect mathematical system, to my knowledge, is an infinity. Now, an infinity, of course, would mean that it's perfect because it measures equally in all ways, in all aspects. There's nothing about it that is decoherent. The infinity is a perfect mathematical essay. So if we take an infinity, and this is the point of your infinite mind field, this is the first kind of point I'm going to pick up from you, and I'll kind of pick up the 3 points that go through. We've got the infinite mind field, we've got the daemon, and we've also got the eternal return. All these flags will appear, and this being the first one, the infinite mind field. So we start with an infinity. Now, an infinity can be solved in two ways. An infinity can mean that because it's infinite, non-finite, therefore it is in essence nothing, which is to say that it doesn't actually have any expression. But an infinity, because it can be anything, because by implication of not being anything in particular, therefore we can extrapolate can be anything by proxy. So therefore it can take on form. But any form that it does take on must ultimately be finite in its existence. It can't take on take on an indefinite form. Whatever form it takes, it must keep dissolving away from that form to something else, to something else, to something else. Now, the Buddhists call this impermanence. So they say that every form that appears in consciousness ultimately is impermanent, that every form that appears ultimately dissolves and evolves into something else. And it does so, of course, because its true nature is non-finite, infinite, and therefore it can't take on an absolute expression. Whatever form it takes is accommodated by the infinity, because it can take any form, but ultimately it must dissolve and become something else and become something else. So now what we have with our perfect mathematical essay, with our infinity, is that the infinity can be expressed in two ways. One way is when it is all things at once, and therefore by implication it's nothing. And the other way it expresses itself is when it is lots and lots and lots of separate things interacting with each other, evolving and dissolving. And so the idea of the bicentric mind is that the mind likewise has developed in this way. So now we're thinking about the universe as being more like a mathematical essay that's expressing itself in two different ways. And the two different ways it expresses itself in, one is that it is the kind of more infinite type essay, and the other one is the more semi-permanent, impermanent forms, a la the world we see around us, which is basically forms evolving and dissolving. So both are allowed by the infinity. Now, what we would expect for both of those types of mathematical essays is if they took shape and became a world, as in what we experience, one would anticipate that likewise we would have to have two types of physics to accommodate them. One type of physics would accommodate the infinite, and the other one would accommodate the more finite structures. Now, the more finite structures would never have any value onto themselves. We couldn't talk about any particular part of that as an individual component because, of course, it relates to everything else. And therefore, we'd have to have a relative theory, which is what Einstein gives us. So Einstein gives us four-dimensional space-time physics, which effectively means that all the various parts are moving ultimately relative to each other. And they're doing so in a geometric apparatus, which is what he calls the space-time. Space-time is a geometry, basically. He tells us that the more mass an object has, it bends the fabric of the geometry and hence causes things to fall towards it, and that's what creates gravity, and so on and so forth. So that geometry that Einstein teaches us about is known as four-dimensional space-time. So that's one kind of physics we have. Now, if we go into the other type of physics, we have the physics used to describe something that has got infinite possibilities that are ultimately that we don't really have a physics to describe it per se. We've got this physics of nothing, so to speak. So we know that our best guess at the moment in terms of where the universe comes from, of course, is that it comes from nothing. That's what we have at the moment. So you would expect that we got one physics to describe the universe in its quadridimensional apparatus as Einstein prescribes and as we experience ordinarily. And then we need another kind of physics to describe nothing. Now, we don't really have a physics to describe nothing because that's a paradox. How can you be a physics of nothing? But what we do have is something in between. So we've got this kind of physics of nothing on the one hand of the scale. So that's the nothing mind, or the infinite mind. And then we also have the kind of the mind of form, which is the mind we're experiencing currently. And then we've got something in between. So what I would expect in between would be quantum physics. Now, quantum physics can describe to some extent, at one end of its scale of concern, it can describe the world of form as we experience it. When you collapse the wave function, you're dealing with, to some degree, ordinary mechanics. It's before you collapse the wave function is where we have the problem. So before you collapse the wave function, what you have is infinite potential. Now, every time we talk about infinite potential, the kind of tendency of the theoretical analyst is to try to pour intellectual cement into that area and try to make it into something solid. The material reductionist wants to pour material cement into this infinite potential, and hopefully they'll find something solid in there and talk about that in terms of physics. But of course, you can't do that because there's not. It doesn't. Ordinary physics doesn't accommodate that. So what you have in effect, therefore, is you've got this kind of thing that you can't even talk about it. You cannot, every time you approach it and say, well, it's kind of like this or it is that. No, you can't describe it. the very act of description conceptualizes it and creates something that doesn't marry up to what it is, because what it is infinite, as I said. So you have this infinity, and then you have what the infinity expresses, which is the world around us. And then, of course, you've got what's between the infinity and between the form, and that's this kind of hybrid zone, which is quantum physics. So in that regards, quantum physics has got one leg in the infinity and one leg in form. And hence we have the collapse of the wave function describing that to us in every possible way. And of course, what's ultimately experiencing all this is consciousness. Consciousness is experiencing itself normally in form, but it also experiences itself as non-form. But it does so in a kind of a roundabout fashion. To me, the consciousness doesn't experience itself, for example, during sleep. We don't say I was asleep and I was conscious of being asleep, but we can infer the fact that I was asleep from knowing about sleep and looking at that from a waking perspective. So likewise, I don't think that the infinite mind can perceive itself directly. I think that the infinite mind can perceive itself indirectly from the conscious mind. So the unconscious mind, or the infinite mind, is ultimately what yields the conscious mind, but it never knows itself without experiencing itself through the conscious mind, so to speak. Now, of course, the conscious mind, incidentally, is also becoming exponentially more complex in terms of its perception of itself and so forth. And what I see in that regard is actually that there is a kind of a meta mind overseeing this. Now, this is your daemon stepping on stage right here. And the daemon to me is actually a kind of hyper mind that actually is able to adequately straddle both the unconscious and the conscious mind, that it has sufficient understanding of the nature of its being to know that although it perceives itself as these finite interacting components, which are you and me experiencing this conversation right now, but it also has the meta-perception of itself as being both you and me at the same time. And it does that because it has merged its unconscious, infinite, all things are one type consciousness with its I'm separate. So the egoic mind and the unconscious mind have come into a kind of a hybrid mind, so to speak. And that mind is the daemon, so to speak. And therefore, this egoic mind that we're experiencing right now is actually being guided by that daemonic mind towards this higher state of consciousness. And it's doing that because that is the teleos of this process, is that consciousness ultimately starts by being unconscious, and then it takes on a form, which is the ego, which is you and I. And it does that through various kind of evolutionary stages, and I'm just talking about not just biology, psychology, within your own lifetime, within your own tribe, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, all consciousness seems to want to move from being unconscious to being more conscious. Now, my theory would be that ultimately when it reaches peak consciousness, when it absolutely knows everything that it is, therefore it stands to reason that by knowing all of that, it collapses back into a zero state. Because if everything knows what everything is, everything knows that everything is everything, and therefore is nothing by implication. It starts at zero and the whole cycle starts again. And then it moves towards this state. So we probably only ever experience everything in between. Because once we know that we're everything and everything is everything, there's no sense of anything. Once more, you're back into the infinity complex again, the infinity paradox. Because the infinity, as I said, would eliminate any sense of discretion between various aspects of itself, and therefore would have no experience of itself. So I think that we can get close to that, but I think ultimately once consciousness does reach that it collapses into a zero state, and then the whole process begins again. So I think there's everything in between. And what we have in terms of our experience of that is we start, as I said, with this kind of, in the beginning we have the zero state, then the zero state separates into its various kind of parts, so to speak, and those parts are initially four-dimensional. They're four-dimensional, they have an egoic sense of being as in us. Ultimately that merges towards a kind of a forging of a higher understanding through mutual discussion, like this podcast, for example, like the various people we're connected with the podcast, writing our books, etc. What we're doing is we're telling each other, I'm figuring this thing out. Are you figuring this thing out? And you have a higher understanding of this in the same way that I have. And by bringing ourselves towards that, we're moving towards our higher demonic selves. And therefore, just, and I don't want to don't absolutely fucking labor the point here because I'm probably rambling on too much, but you're getting the picture here building. So the bicentric mind, as I said, therefore the mind has two centers. One center is the center of self, or ego, or consciousness, and the other center is the unconscious, which is the infinite self. And that neither really is more or less pure than the other one. They're both equally relevant. But what we are is we're not the unconscious infinite everything. We're not the conscious finite egoic something. We're both. And the part of us that knows this in the pyramid of affairs is the daemon. The daemon is what is ultimately experiencing both at the same time. And what it seems to be our journey is to try to resolve this paradox in our own lifetime. And this is the punchline. This is your eternal return idea. It would appear to me that ultimately we may possibly be living the same life over and over again. Ultimately, the challenge each time is to try to resolve this paradox, that it is the daemon that's experiencing itself as the unconscious and the conscious every time. And that what it's trying to do is it's trying out different narrative essays, each one giving us a little more clarity as to ultimately what our true nature is. Then when we die, if there is such a thing, it won't be so much that there is an ending per se, but we already have forged a sufficient understanding that when the time of death does occur, that we don't end up in the proverbial bardo states that the Tibetan Buddhists describe, where you're basically having a bad LSD trip when you die, and then you're born into another body out of panic. That in fact, what might actually happen is because we have forged an understanding of the nature of our world, that we actually transcend this four-dimensional reality and move into a new dimension of physics, which incidentally I expect to be more like a lucid dream or more like a psychedelic trip. And the type of physics there would be something along the lines, although I expect it's quantum in nature, and I think the kind of geometry we're talking about there, although we haven't really got into this yet, I think theoretical physics will start to move towards this. I think instead of being four-dimensional space-time geometry, it's going to be sacred geometry. And sacred geometry is the geometry of the infinity. Because with sacred geometry, when we understand it, it's all about relating things to each other in fashions that are effectively fractal. It's very much Taoist type theory. Nothing exists without its opposite, yin yang. So it's more Chinese philosophy and the likes. And that to me is where we're heading towards, a higher state of consciousness where we bring where we start to kind of dissolve the bicentricity of the mind and move into a higher state of consciousness. And I think that will be very much experienced initially as out-of-body experiences, lucid dreaming, schizophrenia, hypnosis, anything along those lines. There are various aspects of that. So I'm going to shut the fuck up for a while, and you can pick up on all that.
Wow. Fascinating. And I can see so much synergy in the work I've been doing. And in fact, my next book, which will be called Opening the Doors of Perception, where I deal with entheogens, I deal with the liminal areas of consciousness, such as the areas of migraine and schizophrenia, autism, Alzheimer's, these areas. But I was very much struck by the way you'd logically put that together, in the sense of the idea of infinities and infinities of infinities. And I'm reminded of the ideas of people like Cantor and Cantorian maths and everything else as well. Because when people use the term infinity, it's one of these kind of terms that people don't necessarily fully understand mathematically as to exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about infinities. And there are different sorts of infinities. There's a guy called, I think, Robin Lee Poidevin, that wrote a wonderful book about this a few years ago, and I thought it was very, very interesting. I like your idea of applying the teleological argument of exactly, and for the non-philosophers out there, teleology is very much from the Greek telos, which is the end. In other words, everything is developing for a purpose. and there will be a reason for the ending. So in other words, it's almost history in reverse. And many people, when they discuss my work, will say, well, what is the ultimate purpose of Cheating the Ferryman? What is the idea of infinitely living your lives over and over again? And of course, the argument is because we are learning. We are learning to understand ourselves. We are learning about what it is about us within a greater universe. Now, again, one or two of the other areas you touched upon I really liked as well was the idea of the 0 point in terms of 0 point energy, the idea of the way in which we have virtual particles, that is particles that seem to come into existence from nowhere for a split second and then go back into non-existence again, which again, a lot of lay people out there will argue, well, that's impossible. But this is how a lot of the quantum physics that you read in academic papers can explain certain quantum behaviors. And the only way you can do this by bringing in these magical infinite virtual particles that come from nowhere, that come out of the quantum field and have an effect and then disappear again. Which then moves on to the work of people like Martin W. Ball, who's been a guest of this program, and in the past, Professor Bernard Heisch. Again, Martin W. Ball has come up with something called the entheological paradigm, and Bernard Heisch has come across something he calls the God theory. And again, both of these is the idea that what we're effectively doing is we are suffering from amnesis, in the sense of the way the Platonics would argue it, in the sense that we are an embodied Godhead experiencing itself subjectively while suffering amnesis. And the ultimate aim of the God within the program, within the simulation, if we want to call it this, whatever is the four-dimensional space we exist within, some form of non-materialistic simulation. And again, at the moment, somebody who's starting to become interested in the work here, and I'm becoming very interested in his work, is Professor Eric Steinhardt in America, who is a theological philosopher who's coming up with very simple ideas to both what Rory and I are discussing here. So we have this wonderful Uber model of what reality may be. But what I'd like to do now is to move on from here, because I think the way you put your idea together is very, very exciting, extremely exciting, Rory. I have to say that, you touch upon this in your book, but you've expanded a lot more from your book in terms of these ideas. But for the people out there that lucid dream, for the people out there that have out-of-the-body experiences or believe that they're having out-of-the-body experiences, where both you and I would probably agree they're more complex than that. How does this model work within your own model of lucid dreaming? And indeed, can you tell the listeners a little bit about your experiences with lucid dreaming, your ideas on lucid dreaming, and where your work is taking you in terms of that area as well?
Yeah, so first of all, let's just look at dreaming and how we normally experience it. We normally don't have a sense of meta-reflective self when we're dreaming, which is to say that if I was dreaming and somebody called my name, I would respond, and therefore I must have a sense of self. So let's not say we don't have a sense of self when we're dreaming. Likewise, the way I behave in dreams is according to the mechanics of my physical body as I normally experience it, hands and legs and so forth. So we interact with dreams with a body, which means that in a dream we're identifying with a body, and that therefore is also an expression of self. So we do have a sense of self in dreams. What we don't have, as I outlined in the book, is that we don't have this internal dialogue that we normally have that is able to contemplate the kind of metaphysical circumstance that it's in. We don't have the internal dialogue in a dream to actually stop and ask, am I dreaming? That's quite a leap of internal linguistics to do that, and we don't ordinarily do that in dreaming. And the reason we don't ordinarily do that in dreaming is because there would seem to be a part of the brain that we normally employ to do that kind of thinking, the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the neocortex, and various other organelles in the brain. It's not just the prefrontal cortex, but there are other aspects of higher states of consciousness, other aspects aspects of the neocortex that we would need in order to have that meta dialogue in ourselves about ourselves during our prevailing circumstances. So we don't ordinarily have that in our dreaming state, whereby when we're awake we can stop and say, well, where am I, what am I doing here, and in fact who am I, and what was I doing 2 minutes ago. We can have all those kind of bizarre existential insights about the nature of our reality when we're awake. We don't have that when we're dreaming. So that's the fundamental difference. So we're going to talk about those two minds, the dreaming mind and the waking mind, and we can give them a couple of labels. We can call the dreaming mind the intuitive mind. The intuitive mind, incidentally, is the mind that just acts according to its circumstances. It doesn't ask why, it doesn't question, it doesn't kind of get into a whole hoo-ha about why I should, why I shouldn't. The egoic mind, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. The egoic mind is constantly looking to understand why I should do something or why I shouldn't do something. So normally, when we're negotiating our waking lives, we're constantly monitoring our world, and we're constantly asking, should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? Why should I do this? What did he say? What did she say? Why did I say that? Why are they looking at me that way? So when we're dreaming, on the other hand, the brakes are off. We just do whatever the fuck we want to do. So what's the difference? Well, the difference between the two is that the waking mind has a sense of self. Now, a sense of self means that there is a chance that this self that we're so attached to could potentially perish. So that self, that egoic self, is at threat of not getting what it wants. Fundamentally, it's actually a threat of dying. That's its main concern. It lives in a world that ultimately knows one day I'm going to die. Now, the only way you can die, incidentally, is if you live in something called time. Time, of course, being in four-dimensional space-time mechanics. If the self is basically a product of time, you can't actually experience time without a sense of self. If I asked you what does 5 minutes feel like in a dream, you wouldn't really know, because we don't have a sense of time in dreams. There's just a sense of stuff going on. You don't dream last night and say, and for 10 minutes in the dream I was doing this, because we don't ordinarily have a perception of it. Or at least if we do, we can kind of make that perception afterwards. But during the dreaming experience, we don't have a sense of time. So we're now starting to see that the waking state has a meta-reflective sense of self. It has a sense of the imminent departure of its own being, which is death. And it has this because it has a sense of time. And without a sense of time, how are you going to die? If you just exist in the eternal moment, nothing is born and nothing dies. It's just now. It's just now. There's nothing coming and going in the permanent moment, in the present moment. So the intuitive mind, which is the mind we dream with, does not have four-dimensional space-time concerns, because it doesn't live in time. It experiences itself in the present moment. Because the intuitive mind, which is the mind we're dreaming with, the mind that doesn't have a sense of self, because it doesn't exist in time, it can therefore perform duties that would be beyond space-time mechanics. Hence, it can fly, it can walk through walls, etc., etc. So now what we have is we have the kind of bicentric mind experiencing itself here in its authenticity. So one sense of it is the mind that is four-dimensional in essence. It has a sense of self. It has a fear of its own death. And it spends its time ultimately trying to find ways of not dying. That's what it does. The waking mind spends its time, although we like to experience nice experiences and fun experiences and creative experiences and artistic experiences, we experience all those things too. But at the root of all of our experience is the fact that one day we're going to die, and therefore we have to protect our circumstance. Now, whether that means protecting your food from somebody taking it off you, or whether it means protecting your experience of having what a good time is, ultimately we're trying to hold on to this experience. We're trying to hold on to it. In Buddhism, they'll talk about that as, the fundamental nature of suffering is that we become attached to this identity that we're trying to protect, and because we're trying to protect it, we're driving ourselves crazy. Now, the dreaming mind doesn't have that. The dreaming mind will do all sorts of craziness. It'll jump off a high building. It'll fly in the air. It'll pick up a machine gun and fire it. It doesn't matter, because it doesn't have as we said, the biological infrastructure to allow a sense of self to emerge. If no sense of self emerges, there is no frame of reference. And if there's no frame of reference, you can't have time, because time only exists from one thing relative to something else. So because we have no sense of self, we have no frame of reference, we have no sense of causality, and therefore what we have in essence is a mind or a state of consciousness that's experiencing itself not in the classic rational four-dimensional causal apparatus. It's something closer to the kind of quantum physics type essay. But of course, because we're so habitually involved in our four-dimensional state of consciousness, we tend to treat dreaming as a four-dimensional experience, and hence most of our dreams are actually pretty ordinary. Now, a lucid dreamer, by contrast, will have the intellectual insight to recognize that they're in a dream state, and as we know from dreams, even for those of us who haven't become lucid, we know that dreams are pretty flexible in terms of their mechanics. And so what that means is that we get just enough conscious foothold, so to speak, by bringing the egoic mind into the intuitive mind and mixing the two. And that's when we start to experience what I alluded to earlier on, which is this more demonic state of consciousness. Now, in this demonic state of consciousness, what we're effectively able to do is marry both the kind of the infinite mind, which is ultimately the unconscious mind, and the egoic mind, which is the mind of form. And we're able to bring them into this hybrid apparatus, but we're doing so in a controlled fashion. So in this regard, I consider lucid dreaming to be, this might sound controversial, but I consider lucid dreaming to be a controlled state of schizophrenia. Because for me, the schizophrenic is experiencing the same thing, effectively, except that instead of having kind of dragged themselves up by their own bootstraps into this experience with intention and integrity and intellectual insight, I think that the schizophrenic has kind of fallen backwards, head over heels into this state of consciousness and doesn't know how they got there necessarily. When you take a psychedelic, it could only be described as acute psychosis. It could only be described as acute schizophrenia. And no question that, in my own model of dreaming, as I've alluded to in the book, and certainly as described by Alan Hobson, who I kind of largely robbed the model of, Hobson describes ordinary dreaming as a kind of nocturnal neurosis, a nocturnal psychosis. That he says that, in fact, that according to his model of this matter, and incidentally, he's a professor, I believe or he's certainly something of that ilk, of neuropsychiatry, neurobiology in Harvard University in the States. But this guy, he's known for his hypothesis, the synthesis activation theory, which really is the backbone of how we look at the model of dreaming mechanics today. So he really is the proverbial Einstein of dreaming, and if people don't know him, his credibility speaks louder than anything I'm going to say. But his model of dreaming basically speculates that every night that we actually suffer from, he doesn't quite call it schizophrenia. He gets close to calling it schizophrenia. He has a slightly different term for it, and the name, it's in my book and it escapes me for some reason, but it's some kind of acute nocturnal psychosis. It has all the characteristics of schizophrenia, every single one, except for one, which is acute emotional outbursts. But incidentally, I show with psychedelics that actually that can be accommodated as well. But either way, what he shows is that we seem to suffer from this kind of occasional form of necessary schizophrenia or thereabouts. So why would the brain be doing that? And moreover, what could that mean? Well, I guess what that means is if the brain ordinarily tends this kind of schizophrenic episodes every night, so to speak, then it stands to reason that the brain could ordinarily turn that into some sort of pathology. If the proverbial valve between the two states was broken, then it would be natural for somebody to fall into that state. But likewise, it should also theoretically be possible for somebody to bypass that valve by going the opposite direction and intentionally trying to have that experience. And what would that ultimately yield for us in terms of our evolutionary development, in terms of our own psyche? I suppose that's the question then. Why would you want to enter into this state if it sounds so profoundly dangerous? And the answer there for me really is about exploration of states of consciousness. So this really is what it comes down to from where, as far as I'm concerned. I think that where we evolve next won't necessarily be just in our biology. I think that nanotechnology is one avenue of evolution that we're going to take. But I also think that, ultimately, whether it be, our heads getting bigger and our bodies getting smaller, as is prescribed by the kind of more, how would I say, conventional, that antiquated view of what we're going to look like in the future, big heads and small bodies, because our brains are getting bigger and our bodies, we need them less. That's a very kind of, it's a very basic idea of what evolution does. Evolution is far more complex than that. But I think we can certainly anticipate nanotechnology. The symbiosis of technology and biology is certainly part of our evolutionary future. But how we're going to experience it, and this is the punchline, how we're actually going to experience that ultimately, I believe, is going to be as this kind of higher state of consciousness, whereby we will be able to experience ourselves in two places at once. We will be experiencing ourselves non-locally. We'll be able to experience, psychic interactions, because, we will evolve to such a state where the distance between all things ultimately will be the same as it is in a dream, as it is in a computer simulation, for that matter. And I suppose then that brings on the question of the simulation theory, because simulation theory really, which is the idea that the universe is a computer simulation, would be equivalent to a dream theory. What do you in terms of the mechanics, everything about simulation theory and dream theory would come down to the same thing. But ultimately, I suppose the question is, what are we trying to do here? Why do anything? And the answer would be, so far as I'm concerned, that consciousness just seems to want to know itself, that there is a natural gradient of curiosity within consciousness to know itself, and that we are simply flowing along that gradient of curiosity of consciousness to understand itself. And the only way it understands itself ultimately is by transcending its current state. And our current state, as I said, is four-dimensional. But there are certainly cracks in that model, not just philosophically and intellectually, but there are cracks in terms of the experience of that model. We're experiencing out-of-body experiences. We're experiencing lucid dreaming, psychedelic experiences, and so forth. So it only stands to reason that we have to explore them further and to actually take them along their natural intellectual discourse, to try to give them more of a body, to try to actually understand these things, and that's what the duty of the Oneironaut is. That's what your writing is about. That's what my writing is about. That's why we're connecting here today, is to try to build that community, to build that tribe, as Diaz says, and I think that it is a tribal thing. I think that we are actually building a new reality. And the way we're building this orthogonal reality is through the matrix of the internet, because it's allowing us to actually literally step aside and say, hey, this model of reality we've all inherited is not a fact at all. I just found out that nobody really knows the truth. And if nobody knows the truth, then we can build our own reality and say, well, this is our design, this is how we see it, and it's just as relevant as yours. But the mistake we could make by doing that, and this is where the real danger lies, is we could end up doing like everybody else has done so far, building a reality and saying ours is more right than yours. Religion's done that. Science has done that. Spirituality has done that. Everybody's done it at some point. But what we need to do is to come back to the very, very first point I made on the show, is to say that we can deduce a narrative of reality that we can prove to be true within its context, but we can also recognize that it doesn't necessarily mean that because we're correct, that another way of looking at it is wrong. So the infinite mind recognizes that there are in fact infinite patterns that can ultimately express the nature of reality, and none necessarily holds any more inherent value than another one. They're just different ways of describing the same thing. And that's not meaning to open the door for woo-woo ideas and descriptions and saying, well, they're just as relevant because you might as well say that everybody's got an opinion. I'm not saying everybody's got an opinion, every opinion is correct, therefore by implication. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that it would seem to me that there are certainly more elegant ways of expressing it. The most elegant way of expressing it would, of course, be mathematics. But that's the equivalent of saying that English is a very elegant language and is therefore by implication better than Chinese. It's not that it's better necessarily. They're both equally relevant in their own context. It's just that we have to kind of look at them through the lens of what works for us. And we have to take that understanding to its nth degree. But at no point should we ever get so hung up on the way we're looking at it so as to discriminate against the way somebody else is looking at it. If the way they're looking at it can make sense of their world and other people's world and be used in a fashion that is helpful, that is altruistic, then that's okay. It's when it becomes dogmatic, as in religion. It's when it becomes discriminatory, as in material science. It's when it decides that this is how it is and anything else is wrong. That's when the problems start. And that's the mistake that material science is making. Brian Cox will be the first person to tell you that physics works, and I quote, because it's right. It is right. I'm not disputing that. It's right, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can therefore build all models of reality off of that. It doesn't. It doesn't at all. There are so many philosophical axioms that don't add up. There's so much about it doesn't add up. And what I would like people to do is to learn to support the four-dimensional mechanical model of reality, but to likewise be able to support the infinite model of reality, because the infinite model of reality will contain the four-dimensional model. It will be in there in the mathematics. You will be able to find that pattern. And if enough people agree on that pattern, it will become so pronounced in that form of consciousness that it will be confused for what the thing is itself. But what's primary is the infinite model. The infinite model allows all the submodels to take effect. So four-dimensional space-time mechanics is a submodel of an infinite model. And it's the model we're experiencing right now. But we're moving towards this other kind of hybrid model. And as I said, I think it'd be more along the lines of sacred geometry.
Well, it's one of the central issues here, isn't it? That although, you mentioned Brian Cox as an example, and this is an example of the certitude that people have that in some way present science has all the answers, which science by its very nature is seeking answers. And I don't think that science is deliberately avoiding and ignoring things, but there is these kind of grandiose statements that are made and this grandstanding that's made that the quantum physics explains everything. Well, of course it doesn't, because the issue will be that we have no bridging mathematics between quantum physics and between relativity. If you stick in if you use the formulae and the maths that's applied to quantum physics to relativity, you effectively get infinity, which again is an intriguing concept, because what this is telling us is that we haven't drilled down far enough in reality yet to have ultimate answers. And maybe there aren't ultimate answers. Maybe it's a bloody big tesseract that we're all confused by. Now, what I was particularly nodding in agreement with you here was the idea of postmodernism, posthumanism, the idea of the bringing together of nanotechnology, the way in which machines and computers can actually become almost biologically functioning. And of course, the major issue we have with this comes down to the hard problem of consciousness. And again, I was reading Eric Steinhardt's book, Your Digital Lives, a couple of days ago at the British Library. And he makes some very interesting points about if you could actually effectively copy a human brain right down to the atomic level, and you could actually digitize all that information and place that within a computer program, would that then be the person you have actually copied? And of course, the issue is it comes down to Chalmers' argument of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. Is consciousness an epiphenomenon of the brain? Well, I'd argue, and I think you'd agree with me on this, that we're turning the thing around. The brain is the processor in which consciousness drives itself within this four-dimensional reality. And consciousness is existing in some way in a field that is outside of the four dimensions of space-time, and is outside of that and viewing from outside, which is when I think your very, very valid point about hyperconsciousness. And is hyperconsciousness the field? Because in effect, everything is information. Vlatko Vedrell has written wonderful books on this subject about the idea of everything is digital, everything is mathematical, everything is reducible in this way. But these things are non-physical. They don't have extension in space, as Descartes would call it. But then again, one could argue that many subatomic particles, particularly photons, do not arguably have an extension in space because they are point particles. There is no extension in space. And these are the building blocks. These are the carriers of information, the bosons that carry information in one way or another. So quantum physics is very much building these ideas. Your ideas are now going in a very interesting direction. So where do you think, we have around about 4 minutes left now, 3 or 4 minutes left. So where do you think everything is going? Where are your ideas taking you now? Where do you want your ideas to go? I think the statement you made before about being non-judgmental about any other ideas is profoundly important. But where are we going to take this now? How are we going to take these great ideas forward and get them out there into the zeitgeist, into the Weltgeist, so that people are going to be turning around and saying, these ideas are important and we collectively need to think about them?
Yeah, so I've got an idea. I'm currently putting it in inverted commas and I'm calling it alternative. And it's the idea of an alternative to TED. I think that TED has kind of run amok with itself. I think they flagged their true colours with the whole Rupert Sheldrake and Graham Hancock affair, where they basically were deciding what good science was and what anything else was. And for those who are not aware, the controversy, both Graham Hancock and Rupert Sheldrake were doing their talks. One was about psychedelics, the other was about the philosophy of science, and both were considered to be unscientific. Well, we are delighted that the directors of TED, the rulers of what can be considered to be scientific integrity or not, were able to rule on that for us. So that's really where I think the problem is. I think that alternative thinking has always been, and we're not the pioneers of alternative thinking, but I think that what we are doing is we're trying to kind of build constructive alternative thinking. I have no time for conspiracy theories. I have no time for wishy-washy notions about spirituality and nonsense like that. I've got a lot of time for rational thinking, intelligent philosophy, people who are qualified, albeit from an intellectual standpoint or from a deep experiential point of view. I'm not as interested in, last night I had this really amazing experience and I saw this really weird, that has no appeal to me whatsoever. I'm interested in metaphysics and people of that persuasion. And I think where we have to head next is to the stage with it, really, and that's what I want to do this year. I think I want to try and build a platform whereby we can get speakers getting on stage, maybe in the TED fashion, 15 minutes, or I think 18.23, some number, just to wind them up, 18.236675557 seconds or something like that, just to, and I think alternate TED's a funny name for it because it kind of makes the point basically in your face, but then that might end up causing, more controversy than it needs. But I think that's the key. I mean, look, the key to this thing is the internet, basically. And, you can only achieve so much with your own meetup groups. You can only sell so many books. You can only reach so many people with the platforms we're using. I think that the real strength is going to come when we start to get groups of speakers together, and we can get them doing 15, 20 minutes on a nice live show, record it, video it, send it out into the net, and start planting those seeds in people's consciousness so new ideas start to take form in the social matrix. And those ideas ultimately will create a new reality. But the key to this thing certainly is the internet. There's no question about that. So that's the plan. I think this year, as I said, I want to try and get that out there. So we might even just be starting with you and me on stage, having a chat. I've seen Krishnamurti and I believe it was Wheeler. Maybe it wasn't Wheeler.
David Bohm. David Bohm.
It was Bohm. Yeah, I did great book, great talk, and I like that idea as well, just two intellects going at it and just throwing it out there, and just changing up the game. The old model of your mother knows best, the church knows best, and science knows best, and in that order necessarily or not. But that old paradigm of somebody else knows best, they don't know best because they don't know either, which means this thing's up for grabs, and we ought to take a shot at it.
Excellent. So if anybody wants to get in contact with you, your website, various other details, so if you can let everybody know, because I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be very interested in this, because you have come across, as you always do, absolutely fantastically, very erudite, very knowledgeable, and that's what I admire about you. You're grounded, you're using science in a non-judgmental way, and I think this is important without the woo-woo, and I totally agree. That's music to my ears. There are too many snake oil salesmen out there who deflect collect from what people like you and I do, and the actual people that want to destroy the things we can do love that. They love these guys. They love the guys getting information from the planet Tharg. They love it, and they will play up on that, and they will use that to destroy us, because we are the dangerous guys. We are the ones that really do, well, worry them's not the term. They just would prefer to ignore us. But they can't ignore us for much longer, because we're building a groundswell. So, Rory, let the guys out there know how they can contact you, get involved in your work and everything else.
So if you are listening from the planet Tharg, or planet Earth for that matter, best place to get me at the moment, actually, I'm taking a leaf out of Anthony's book, one of many leaves I've taken out of his books, is Facebook, actually. Anthony works Facebook incredibly well, and I am starting to practice the same thing. I like to look at other people, how they work, and I'm always willing to kind of tell you where I'm getting my ideas from, and certainly Anthony's killing it on Facebook. So find me on that. You can follow me on Facebook. Reality Check Podcast is my page. You're probably better off picking me up there. Just like the page, and you'll be able to pick me up from anything there. Feel free to message me. You can friend me if you like. Follow me. It's probably a bit easier rather than friend me. And just find me there, basically. Other than that, you can find me on Twitter at Reality Check Podcast, and on my own website, wakeupinyourdreams.com. And the book, incidentally, is The Paradox of Lucid Dreaming, a metaphysical theory of mind. That's me kind of saying my piece. I've had a lot of the floor today, so I appreciate that. But hopefully, as I said, we can maybe talk about this live in London or something like that. I think that's the way forward, is just more of this stuff and getting people out to see it. You know?
Excellent. No, that'll be really good. And as I say to everybody, I don't know if it will come across here, but this is Rory's book. Well worth reading. I really enjoyed it. Right, the next guest here will be somebody that Rory knows really well, which is Robert Waggoner, who was an earlier guest in another show I did many, many years ago. And this is going to work in very, very well, because we've got Robert Waggoner coming on board, we've got Jürgen Zever coming on board, and also as an announcement, if anybody's interested, Graham Nichols and myself will be doing a 5-week online course as part of one of his programs, which will be starting next month after I get back from Australia. And I'm very, very excited about this, so people can join us live. And Graham and I will be splitting the details of what we're going to be talking about. But effectively, if you check on my Facebook page, I've got full details about that as well. Rory, thank you very much for a wonderful chat. We will do this again. And as always, the forgotten lady in the background over there in probably cold and snowy Denver, Dia Nunez, because without Dia Nunez and her H2O network, this would not be possible. And as always, thank you very much. And thanks, guys, and we'll see you next month, where we'll be talking to Robert Waggoner. Thank you.
Thank you.